What can teachers do to improve the reading growth in children during their critical first years of school? This is the Leaders of Transformation podcast. And on this show, we interview difference makers and world changers who are disrupting for good. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Nicole Jansen, and our guest today is Jessica Sliwerski. She is driven by an unshakable commitment to ensuring that every student in America is given the right to read on time, and she founded Ignite Reading, a virtual reading skills intervention literacy program to do that. And today we're going to talk about the crisis of illiteracy in America. You might be surprised at how prevalent it is. We're going to talk about the root issues of the cause and also, of course, what Jessica and her team are doing about it. So, Jessica, welcome to the Leaders of Transformation. We're glad you're here.
I am so excited to be here. Nicole, thank you so much for this opportunity to share the amazing work that we're doing at Ignite Reading and my own story of leadership.
My pleasure. And before we dive in, I want to do a shout out to James Friedland. He's the one who introduced us. So thank you, James, for the introduction. And also, he found out about this show through Dr. Kimberly Behrens, and she was on the show in episode 428. And that was an amazing conversation as well. And so I'm just going to say to our listeners and viewers, if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it. She is extremely passionate about learning proficiency in children and is also very involved in the solution, just as Jessica is. So, Jessica, let's talk about, to start off with, this crisis of illiteracy. Where did it start and where are we at right now with it?
So a lot of people don't realize that we have a crisis of illiteracy in this country. And upon hearing about this crisis, their immediate assumption is that it has something to do with COVID and the fact that kids missed a lot of schooling for about a year and a half. But actually, Nicole, the problem persisted long before COVID, and COVID merely exacerbated it. And today, based on our nation's report card, what we see is that 67% of fourth graders in our country do not read at grade level. That heartbreaking statistic carries through and correlates to eighth grade proficiency and even adult illiteracy. And the reason that so many of our nation's children don't read at grade level is not because something is wrong with them, but in fact, because educators have largely been ignoring the research around how the brain learns to read and not equitably providing all kids access to learning to crack the code. So whereas oral language is something that our brains have evolved to be able to naturally do, learning to read is not a natural process. It doesn't automatically happen. The vast majority of children need explicit, coherent, systematic, direct instruction to learn to crack the code, to then read with automaticity and fluency. And so what we're doing with Ignite Reading is creating a model to ensure that every single child in this country has access to a highly trained reading instructor so that they can learn to crack the code and read on time, which we define as the end of first grade.
So what inspired you to kind of get into this space and become a literacy specialist?
So I started my career as a classroom teacher almost 20 years ago, and I had an untraditional path into education. I wasn't actually planning to be a teacher, although in retrospect, it completely makes sense. I grew up surrounded by educators. My mom was a teacher. My aunts were educators. My grandmother was a teacher, and I have lots of fond memories of going into their classrooms and watching them teach. And also my mom, I remember her being a substitute teacher at my elementary school and having so much pride about the fact that my mom was in the school building teaching other kids. And then I spent a lot of time volunteering in schools throughout high school and college. And nonetheless, I thought I would be a lawyer, but was drawn to Teach for America my senior year of college. And I thought, what else is a better way to spend the next 2 years teaching and getting a master's in education? And then I thought, I'll go to law school after. But what happened instead was that in my first week of my first year of teaching, my eyes were wide open to how deeply inequitable education is in our country. And that completely changed my trajectory, because I made a commitment to myself then and there that I was going to stay in education and that I was going to find a way to ensure that no teacher ever felt the way that I felt, which was this feeling as I my 22-year-old self, who had very little preparation in teaching, was standing in front of a classroom of fifth graders, many of whom were still non-readers, and I had no idea how to help them. And it wasn't until my third year of teaching, when I went to a different school in New York City, where I just happened to be given an evidence-based reading curriculum and professional learning. And I began teaching my first graders to read. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a science. There is a specific way to teach children to read. And this is not rocket science. And that lit this spark in me around wanting to figure out how to help as many kids as possible learn to read, and how to help as many teachers as possible teach their kids to read. But I was still very early in my career, and so I had no idea how I was going to do that. But I'm the kind of person who just says yes to anything. And so opportunities over the course of my career presented themselves, and I just kept saying yes to them. And so I went from being a classroom teacher to a school leader to an instructional coach for kindergarten through 12th grade, developing teachers with a focus upon literacy. I was a principal coach across New York City. I was organizing literacy initiatives for a network of 22 schools. And through all of these experiences, I began to hone my understanding of what high quality instructional practices in literacy look like, and what it means to get results for kids. And co-founded my very first company a little over 10 years ago with a focus upon literacy, which then led to me a few years thereafter running a nonprofit publishing company in K-12 education. And one of the programs in our portfolio is this incredibly effective foundational reading skills curriculum that I even used to teach my own child to read. And that was the moment where, it had been at that point almost 20 years since I first stepped into the classroom, and I had finally amassed all of the right experiences and skills to incubate this concept, Ignite Reading, and what it could mean to bring a highly skilled reading teacher virtually to every single child in our country, so that once and for all, we have a path to eliminating this crisis of illiteracy.
Well, I love the fact that you're focusing on the educators themselves. There's a lot of criticism in certain circles around teachers and them not teaching the right way or teaching their children the best way. And I think that is obviously because people are realizing that something's wrong. And yet what you're doing is saying, here, let's give you the tools. These people wanted to become teachers for a reason. They wanted to help, and they presumably loved kids, and like yourself, you wanted to get in there and actually make a difference. And so they need the tools to be able to do that. And so I love the fact that you're actually addressing that, and it's very scalable to do it that way, as well as like what you're saying is that every child gets that opportunity to have that support. Now, before we go in a little bit deeper in there, I know that you actually wrote a book, which I have a copy of. You gave me a copy. Thank you so much for that. And it's called Cancer Hates Kisses. And when I got it, I was kind of like, what does that have to, where's the connection? But then, of course, realizing that it was your story. So tell us a little bit about that journey and, in this book, why you in particularly wrote this book.
So I wrote the book Cancer Hates Kisses as a way to make meaning of a really traumatic experience in my life. And you can hear the trauma in my voice even now as I harken back to that moment. So shortly after the birth of my daughter, 8 years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I don't have a family history of breast cancer. I don't have a gene for breast cancer. It really came out of nowhere and was a incredibly difficult period of my life, right? Like I just become a brand new mom, which was the happiest moment of my life. And then 3 months later, I find a lump, and a month after that was diagnosed with breast cancer. And when it first happened, I kept thinking, why did this happen to me? Right? Like, what did I do to cause this? Why me? And coming out of my mastectomy, which was the surgery I had, my mindset shifted to why not me? This happened for some reason. And because I can't concretely point to why it happened, I'm instead going to craft a narrative that it happened because there is something I am supposed to do with this. And somehow I will use this experience to help other people. And I didn't quite know at the time exactly how I would do that. But over the coming months, I met so many other women who had young children who were going through cancer treatment. And there was this recurring theme around how to tell their young kids what was going on with them. And what I observed was that many of the moms just decided not to tell their kids because they felt like it was too scary or too difficult, or like they just didn't know how to talk about it, so they didn't. Meanwhile, I'm a brand new mom. I have this beautiful infant, and I was drawing so much strength from my daughter. Her name's Penelope. And I felt like this baby was the most incredible healing force in my life. And it made me sad that moms weren't able to bring their kids into the story of what was happening to them in a way that could also be healing. And so I started in my mind to write a book that could help moms, but I couldn't quite figure out, like, how do you write a book about cancer, right? And in a way that's empowering. I knew that I wanted the language to be really straightforward so that young kids could understand what was happening to their mom. I knew that I wanted kids to be able to understand the power that they have in their mom's healing, right? So, I was thinking about all of the things that cancer hates and all of the things that kids can give that cancer would hate, right? Cancer hates love and hugs and compliments and kisses. But then I was also thinking about all of the things that a parent going through cancer treatment goes through and how you explain that to kids. And it all kind of came to fruition when I had my final appointment with my oncologist once I had finished chemotherapy. It was like my chemo graduation appointment. And I was sobbing during that appointment because I did not want to be done with chemo. There was something that felt really safe, even amidst an incredibly awful experience. But at least it was like these toxic drugs, this poison that is in my body is keeping me safe, and I don't want to stop doing this. And my oncologist said to me, you have to put cancer in the rearview mirror and focus on the things that bring you joy, because cancer hates joy. And I was like, bingo, that's the hook. That's the thing. That's the through line for this book that I want to write. And I skipped out of that meeting, got on the subway, and basically banged out my whole draft of my manuscript on that subway ride back to Brooklyn with this whole concept of the things cancer hates. And so, I explain in the book, for example, that, sometimes, first of all, mom is a superhero, because anyone fighting cancer is a superhero. And one of the things superheroes have to do to kick cancer's butt is, have chemo, and chemo is mighty medicine. It kills the teeniest, tiniest cancer cells. And it also makes mom's hair fall out. And so rather than making that a sad, disempowering narrative, the baldness is a sign of beauty and power and strength. And so the kids are marveling at their mother's smooth, bald head, and they tell her she looks beautiful, and she flashes them her dazzling smile, because cancer hates compliments. So like the idea is like, give your mom lots of compliments, right? And what I found in writing this book was that it was healing for me. It was part of my post-traumatic growth. And it's created a resource that is out there in the world to help so many other families who are experiencing this crucible in their lives, and enabling them to bring their young children into the fold in a way that is so hard to otherwise do, because it's such a difficult topic to talk about. And I found that my experience as a former first grade teacher enabled me to craft language in this story that makes sense for young kids, and that tangentially, the creation of a children's book is also part of my bigger passion and obsession with all things literacy. And being a cancer survivor also just further put on steroids my own maniacal passion around teaching kids to read, and is fueling my purpose, especially as I'm now, building this company, Ignite Reading, whose mission is to ensure that all kids have the right to learn to read.
Well, I loved it because, obviously, yeah, I could feel your heartfelt love poured into it. And I love the idea of transforming the negative into the positive, and like, because love casts out fear, and that's what conquers fear and sadness. And I love the simplicity of it, and the way that you keep it simple that kids can understand. And so, they're not afraid. There's mom that's afraid, but then there's also, the children that are afraid, and they don't know what to do. And so, it's a beautiful gift. So thank you. Thank you for that gift. And I love how leaders of transformation have this tendency to just use everything that they're given. And it's not a lot of times people perceive that it's, bad things, but what they do is they use whatever they've been given and turn it into something good. They transform it into something else. And I can see how you do that through your story, through the different experiences that you had, even the challenge that you had teaching fifth grade and saying, this isn't good, this isn't working. How can we do it differently? And I love that. So as we shift back to talking about this idea of children reading, and one of the things that when I was going through the material that you had given me, there's a certain age where a child should be able to read. And there's a certain way that we're teaching them, which is not actually helping them to read properly. And maybe even talk about your own experience with that, realizing that, like, and other parents, that you've talked about, and saying, hey, wait a second, like, my child doesn't actually know how to read. And even though they're achieving the scores, they're getting the grade, and yet somehow there's this huge disconnect. So talk a little bit more in depth about that piece of it.
So I mentioned earlier that learning to read is not a natural process, and kids need this direct instruction. There's a very specific way to teach them to crack the code. The English language is a code. Kids need explicit instruction. It starts with learning letter names, learning their sounds, being able to then put those sounds together to read the most simple words like cat or sit, and then beginning to understand and internalize, and then it's called orthographically mapping to the brain all of these increasingly complex patterns of the code, such that kids can get to a point where they're not having to decode every single word they come to, but they've had enough practice and repetition that it's automatic. And that automaticity then leads to fluent reading of connected text. And when the brain doesn't have to attend to how to read the words, it can instead be freed up to think about what the words mean. And then from there, kids can begin to grapple with increasingly complex text and build knowledge, and all of that then plays into their ability to read and understand more complex text. So it's all very interconnected, but it starts with learning to crack the code. And what a lot of people don't know is that these skills are time bound, and kids need to learn to do this by the end of first grade. There is rhetoric nationally. You'll see policy around this concept of reading by grade 3. But for any parents who are listening, you know that you would not be happy if it took until grade 3 or the end of grade 3 for your child to learn to read. And so really it's about learning to read by the end of first grade, because once they've cracked the code, they're off to the races with building knowledge. And that knowledge building really needs to start in second grade with independent reading, and that all then plays into how they acquire vocabulary and can better comprehend as they move through school, and they're accessing other content areas like science and social studies, and even the literacy components of math like word problems. And the problem is that for decades, educators have been ignoring the research and purchasing curriculum for school districts that blatantly disregards what we know about how the brain learns to read. And meanwhile, teacher preparation programs weren't teaching teachers how to teach kids to read. And so you have generations of kids who've gone through school never being taught to learn to read. And the issue transcends socioeconomic status. But the difference is that parents who have the means to will get tutoring for their kids outside of school. And so there's this shadow system in education where the families who have the ability to hire tutors have been getting tutors to teach their kids to read because they're not learning to read in school. And the families who can't afford tutors, their kids aren't learning how to read. And that is deeply inequitable. Now, there's been like a tidal wave around this phrase, the science of reading, and some incredible work that the journalist Emily Hanford has done to expose this crisis. She has a podcast called Sold a Story that really elegantly lays out what happened and why we're where we are today. There's also a documentary out called The Right to Read film that highlights the crisis as well from a racial equity lens. And so because of this movement around the science of reading and teaching kids how to read, you're seeing a lot of legislation happening around states mandating that Teachers get trained in the science of reading, and districts adopt evidence-based curriculum to teach kids to read. And all of that is wonderful progress. However, change in education, especially transformational change, is slow. And there is an implementation gap between what policy may dictate and what is actually happening in schools and classrooms. And you talked earlier a little bit about teachers, and I want to stamp what you said, because I think in my experience, teachers get unfairly scapegoated for a lot of the ills of public education, when really I see a lot of the problem as a lack of instructional leadership in positions of true power, be they school principals or district leaders, who make decisions that then get pushed down to teachers, and teachers don't have a choice but to follow those decisions, whether or not they're good for kids. And what we're building with Ignite Reading is a model that recognizes both the constraints and opportunities within public education. So while all of these policy shifts are happening, while teachers are being retrained and given new materials that they need to learn how to teach, we are coming in as the reading foundational skills safety net and a critical partner to teachers in the work. Our tutors in our program are not actually teachers. So let me just clarify that. They are largely non-educators. Many of them are college students. It's a paid job when they work with Ignite. They go through a master class in becoming a highly skilled reading teacher. And then they're meeting one-on-one virtually with kids during the school day. So we can't use classroom teachers because they're teaching, but our vision is to ultimately ignite the teacher talent pipeline, because these young people start teaching kids to read. They get totally hooked on it. It is so emotionally gratifying. And then it makes them, we hope, and we're starting to see this, want to become educators. And then when they do step into the classroom someday, they're going to hit the ground running because they already know how to be a highly effective reading teacher. But for the classroom teachers, this is such a gift, the partnership of working with Ignite Reading, because what it enables the teacher to do is have the space to learn to teach this way while still knowing that their kids are going to be okay. And as their kids are all getting the differentiated instruction they need so that they're learning to read, it's also playing into their ability to access the other content that the classroom teacher is teaching. So it's a really beautiful symbiotic relationship, and something that comes from my own empathy and understanding around just how hard it is to be a classroom teacher, and the ways in which we need to be honoring that and supporting them so that they can be as successful as possible, and the kids.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anybody who has 30 kids in a room, or even 20, I mean, that's a lot of children to be responsible for. And I know some of the classrooms are just really busting out in terms of the number of kids to a teacher. Let's talk about specifics in terms of when you say that they're not being taught to read. I can almost hear people saying, yeah, but what do you mean they're not being taught to read? They're being taught to read. And, they're given books to read. They're given instruction on it. But there's a way, and I remember when I grew up, the way I learned was quite different than what I hear is being taught in schools right now. And so when I heard someone talking about this, I was like, what do you mean they're doing it that way? Because that doesn't make sense to me. But there was some theory behind this. And so talk a little bit more specific for those that are wondering what exactly you're referring to. Because some of us might be a little bit older and we're going, oh, what are you talking about? We're good. We know how, I know how to read,
So there's this really great infographic that I use a lot in presentations. It's called The Ladder of Reading by Dr. Nancy Young, and she's done a lot of research around dyslexia in particular. And what this ladder of reading shows is that 5% of kids for whatever reason, maybe their brains are highly evolved, who knows? But for those 5%, learning to read is pretty effortless. So think of this 5% of kids as the child of your girlfriend who shows up to lunch one day and says, "Oh my gosh, my 2-year-old is reading Harry Potter." And everyone else is like, "What? What's wrong with my kid? They're eating Play-Doh." That is an anomaly, right? But that happens. Then you have another chunk of kids, approximately 30%, who learning to read is relatively easy with broad, probably incoherent instruction. What I mean by that is these are the kids who watch Sesame Street from the time they're 2 years old. They're going to preschool. They're being exposed to the alphabet, the sounds letters make. They've got parents at home doing lots and lots of reading, maybe even some direct instruction with them around, like, this is the alphabet, these are the sounds, right? For those kids, they can show up at school and have lots of random lessons that may or may not be grounded in the reading research around how the brain learns to read, and they will still somehow piece it together and learn to read. They might have some random decoding gaps. They might be terrible at spelling until they're older, but they've got it. By the way, that 30% plus 5% basically maps to our nation's proficiency, right? So when you have 33% proficiency in 4th grade as a nation, and it maps so perfectly to what Nancy Young is saying about the kids who don't really need explicit instruction, what that tells you is that we're not actually teaching kids to read, right?
With kind of catering to that group of people.
You're catering to that group who doesn't need it. And then you've got everyone else. Everyone else in this bucket needs explicit, code-based, systematic, sequential instruction. And then there's another chunk of kids, about 10 to 15%, who need, on top of that explicit instruction, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of opportunities for practice and repetition because they're dyslexic, and it takes that much longer for the code to be orthographically mapped to them so that they can look at a word and not have to sound it out. And it's just like, you can't help but read it, right? You glance over someone's shoulder, you're not trying to read their text messages, but your brain can't help itself. And that's because that orthographic mapping has occurred, and dyslexic kids need more time and more practice. And so from an equity standpoint, this, 60% of kids, 65%, they are not going to learn to read without this instruction. And it's wild when I am talking with folks about this who had no idea it was an issue. And then in conversation, inevitably, it will bring up stuff around their own childhood and how they did or didn't learn to read, what they're noticing with their kids, and the difference between one child they may have who falls into that 30% who's going to get it, and another child they have who needs more explicit instruction and their school wasn't providing it. And the parents are like, what the heck, right? There's a lot of incorrect information out there, a lack of understanding around how the brain learns to read, and then it's perpetuated by ineffective practices that educators have used for decades. Now, the beautiful thing is that so many educators are now talking about the science of reading, and there is largely a mentality of know better, do better. But again, the change takes time. And in the meantime, kids have to learn how to read, even as we wait for the system to evolve and catch up. And, what this form of instruction looks like is, at the most basic level, once a child has learned all of the letter names, uppercase and lowercase, all of the sounds that those letters have made or make, then it's beginning to teach them explicitly how to segment and blend the most basic words. So cat, so explicitly modeling at cat, right? And doing lots of practice with those consonant, vowel, consonant words, and then moving to all of these increasingly complex patterns, understanding that SH together goes sh and TH together goes th. And this sounds so basic as I'm talking about it, but Nicole, it's crazy because for decades, schools were not doing this instruction because it was considered boring, right? And instead, there were curriculum publishers who were perpetuating this idea that, well, if you just give them beautiful books and you surround them with rich, beautiful texts, they'll fall in love with reading and they'll magically learn how to read. Or they were perpetuating ideas like, use the picture to help you figure out what the text says. You don't actually need to learn to read the words, just use the pictures. But the problem is that as text becomes increasingly complex, pictures go away. There were incorrect ideas being perpetuated that it's okay to not read a word correctly and instead insert a different word that basically means the same thing. So for example, if the sentence said, I sit on the couch, and instead a student read it, quote unquote, read it by looking at a picture and said, I sit on the sofa, that was considered okay, even though couch and sofa are two different words. So just these practices that blatantly ignored the research and essentially said like, yeah, it's okay to not actually be reading.
Wow. Well, and I think about this idea of memorization and memorizing the way, words are put together. And I remember somebody telling me that, well, what they do is they teach you to memorize, this word and that word. And I'm thinking, yeah, but what if they come across a word that they don't know and nobody's taught them to memorize? How are they going to learn that? And whereas with phonetics, what you're talking about, you can take any word, and I've done it. I mean, even I come across a word that I'm not familiar with, but I can sound it out. And then of course I may not know the meaning, so I've got to look up the meaning and all of that. And so there's got to be some, I don't know, there's got to be some logic. Somebody had a great idea, I guess, and maybe it's just not worked and maybe didn't look at the science, but it's baffling to me, I guess, is the straight comment on that. It's just baffling to me. I don't get
it. It's wild is what it is, right? And in the medical field, there are very specific ways that things are done, right? I'm not a doctor, but it's my understanding that like there is a way that heart surgery is done, and you don't get to just show up in the operating room and be like, yeah, I know what all the research says, I know what all the training says, but I'm going to do it this way instead. And everybody's like, okay, sure. And yet in education, this happens a lot. And it's a shame because it harms our most vulnerable, marginalized children in this country who don't have a safety net of families who can afford a private tutor outside of the school day to make sure they learn to read. And yet the reality is that reading is the operating system of education. If kids cannot read, they cannot learn. And so if you don't learn to read, you can't do anything else in school, let alone life. On top of that, as kids get older and they can't read, beginning in like second grade, it starts to create trauma for them around learning and their identities as learners. And so it is a truly heartbreaking crisis. It is absolutely criminal that as a nation, we've deprived so many children of the right to learn to read. And I feel optimistic about the changes that are happening. And even, the amount of demand that we see for our program is a good sign that educators know that this is a problem. They want to address it, and they're coming to us as a partner who can help them ensure that once and for all of their kids are going to learn to read. Because the other piece of this is that, it's 2023, and in so many ways, our education system is still a factory model of like one size fits all, pitch to the middle. And yet we have technology like video conferencing that creates this really incredible opportunity to bring a real live human to each child, to meet with them every day for 15 minutes a day, building a relationship around the act of learning to read. And when you teach one-on-one, you are able to precisely target that child's individual needs in a way that you just can't do in a small group, let alone a whole class. And teachers know this, and they know that this is what kids need, is this one-on-one support. And so when we partner with a school, it's like the classroom teacher gets, 20 other teachers for 15 minutes a day to come in and serve their babies and make sure that they're going to learn to read.
So before we finish up, and there's so much that we could talk about this, and I love to see your passion for it, and not just your opinion about it, but your research behind it and the science behind it is fascinating. How does your program, because you mentioned about going into schools and working with the kids, how does your program work in terms of like who funds it? And that kind of ties in with those low income areas. How do they get access to this?
So we partner with typically school districts, and the district contracts with us. There's a per seat fee that they pay. And it's by the seat, not the child, because kids come into the program at different points along the continuum of learning to read. Some kids will move more quickly than other kids. And as they graduate out of the program, we want schools then to be able to plop another kiddo into that spot without having to pay more money. They operationalize it.
So not all kids need it.
No, not all kids need it.
Okay.
So we will work with schools to identify which kids are at risk of not learning to read, or are, below benchmark in reading. We do baseline diagnostics for every student in our program to understand precisely what their decoding gaps are. So we're not going to teach them lessons that they don't need. We're not going to waste their time. We start that first day of instruction after the baseline assessments, precisely targeting their individual needs as a developing reader. And we then operationalize the program during the school day. And this is really important because from an equity standpoint, when we were originally envisioning the model, we were thinking, well, maybe schools pay for this, but it's a service that parents access outside the school day for their children. And what we quickly realized was that that's still inequitable because of Wi-Fi issues, device issues, parent with itness, whatever. And we wanted to knock down every possible barrier. And that meant it had to be during the school day. And what we've done is we've designed the program to fit during the literacy block. And there's a specific portion of the literacy block in elementary school each day called independent reading. And if you're a non-reader, you're not reading during that time. And if you're an older kid who's still a non-reader, you're probably finding ways to distract from the fact that you can't read, which can be really disruptive. And so we perfectly integrate into that independent reading time, which means kids who don't need Ignite reading because they've already learned to crack the code can either be independently reading or in a small group working on other literacy skills with their teacher. And all of the kids who are part of Ignite are grabbing their device, clicking a button, logging in, and seeing their human tutor for 15 minutes, which is approximately the length of independent reading anyway, and getting the targeted support they need. So everybody is getting what they need during that time of day.
That is awesome. And I love that it's customized to them. That is great.
Yeah. And it
Yeah.
just feels good. I mean, I think we forget as literate adults, many of us don't remember how we learned to read. Um, it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. And doing hard things as humans, like we don't really want to do hard things if we can avoid it. And that's the same with learning to read in little kids. And so it's really powerful for them to have this connection to a real human. A lot of our kids in our program think that their tutors do nothing but tutor them. So they'll often, talk about my tutor as if it is a tutor that is only theirs and isn't actually helping a bunch of other kids across the country also. And they build these really strong bonds. And because of that relationship and that trust and that love, they are willing to try things that are hard for them. And in doing that, they're gaining new competencies, which is then feeding into greater motivation and persistence. And that then translates into the time outside of Ignite in the classroom when they're given other challenging tasks. And rather than shutting down and opting out, they feel more confident about being able to engage and persist. And so the social emotional learning impact from our program is also really profound.
Yeah. And I think about them being acknowledged and cared for. Like, wow, this person is really focused on helping me in my areas. And there's so much to that. I love it. I was going to ask you about there's so many more questions I had about in terms of virtual learning and teaching in that setting and all of that. And I know that you're also a public benefit corp as well. And I know that a lot more of this information is also on your website. So I think maybe the best thing we're going to do is just we're going to send people to your site to learn more about you and what you're all about. But before we do that, is there anything else that we absolutely need to talk about so that people really get what it is that you're doing and why this is so important?
That is such a great question. I think the biggest thing is being aware that this is an issue so that you can advocate, whether it's for your own child and what you're seeing they need in terms of the proper support to ensure that they learn to read, or advocating for other children who are part of your community. We are constantly recruiting tutors. And, I shared that many of our tutors are college students, but a lot of our tutors are also stay-at-home moms or gig economy workers or career changers or folks who are retired and have a passion for working with children and want to learn a new skill set. And so our website also has a whole section around tutor recruitment. And anyone who wants to become a tutor, when you learn how to teach a child to read, that skill has an inevitable ripple effect, because not only would you be teaching kids to read in the context of Ignite, but you can't help but then use that skill to inform how you parent, or if you're a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, right? If you are the person in your community who knows how to teach kids to read, people will seek you out and you will have the power to transform so many other children's lives. And really, that is like the metaphor of our company, right? Ignite Reading. We're trying to ignite early readers. We're trying to ignite literacy ecosystems in schools and districts. We're trying to ignite the teacher talent pipeline, and we are trying to ignite this massive core of tutors who can be change makers outside of what they're doing each day to teach kids in schools.
Oh, that is so cool. I actually have some people in mind. I'm thinking, I know lots of people that are working from home, moms, that are looking to do something and maybe don't have that full-time capacity to do it but want to make a difference. And so that is awesome. I love it. Well, thank you again, Jessica, so much for being here and for sharing your passion and your expertise in this area. We're going to make sure that, of course, all the links to your I'm also going to mention your book. The links to your book and also, of course, to your website will be in the show notes as well, at ignite-reading.com, and all the links so people can connect with you. And we just really appreciate you being here. And I always say leaders of transformation take action. And so, taking action on something that you shared here, I know that I'm even thinking about how can we incorporate this into, I don't have kids myself, but how can I incorporate this into some of the things that we're doing even through our church and working it with the kids there and helping them, making sure even the signs to recognize when some of the kids are having trouble and how we can support them and not imply that there's something wrong with them, but actually support them in igniting their love of learning, but also giving them the tools they need, like we all do. We all need these tools to be able to learn, and to read and to do anything new. So I appreciate you so much for being here, and thank you to our listeners and our viewers. I would encourage you to go check out what Jessica's doing, and if this has sparked, ignited, pun intended, ignited you in any way, please go check out and see how you can get involved in it. How you maybe even being a tutor, for a few hours a week, you can make a difference in a child's life, and you can be that leader of transformation behind the scenes, helping the next generation of readers and ultimately the next generation of leaders. And so we encourage you to do that. And we appreciate you and thank you for being here. And we look forward to seeing you next week on another episode of the Leaders of Transformation.